It might be said that Isaiah was a privileged prophet. Unlike the other 8th century prophets who proclaimed their messages from outside the palace walls against the corruption that resided within and that filtered down to all levels of Israelite society, Isaiah was a consultant to a king, first Ahaz and later Hezekiah. Yet his closeness to the royal house did not cause him to soften the blows of God's words of judgment. The people had turned away from the Holy One of Israel, but God had not turned away from them. In fact, one day God's justice would reign throughout the earth. Isaiah speaks of a time when nations will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. Mr. Wolfgang Roth focuses on the importance of faith in God that runs throughout the message of the prophets, as well as on the notion of the character of God reflected in the term, the Holy One of Israel.
Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of His glory. You know these words of celebration well because we have been singing them in synagogue and church for centuries. It was Isaiah who first heard them in the temple in Jerusalem. In a vision, he saw the God of Israel enthroned in a heavenly court. There he overheard one of the winged seraphs extolling the divine splendor. But the prophet is overcome with fear. How can he, a sin-marked human being, encounter the divine face to face and yet live? Then one of the celestial beings touches Isaiah's lips with a burning coal from the altar. Now the prophet is able to hear a divine summons. It entrusts him with a puzzling mission. He is ordered to utter words of reproof that the people are destined to hear but not to understand. Then Isaiah said, "How long, O Lord?" And he said, "Until cities lie waste without inhabitant and houses without people, and the land is utterly desolate, until the Lord sends everyone far away, and vast as the emptiness in the midst of the land." The people will grasp the meaning of Isaiah's words only at some point in the future, when disaster and exile will overcome them. The emphasis on God's holiness is a hallmark of the biblical book of Isaiah. You will notice how Isaiah speaks of the sovereign power of the Holy One of Israel in several ways. Thus, when Jerusalem and its royal court tremble because civil war or a siege by the Assyrian emperor threaten, the prophet calls the people to turn to the Holy One for help and support. Reliance on human allies and their armies is in vain, because they represent flesh, not spirit. Or notice how exploitation of less powerful members of society at home, in the kingdom of Judah and the city of Jerusalem, is branded as denial of the Holy One. This is so because Israel's God is exalted by justice. In other words, humility and mercy befit human beings, so that all, whatever their station, exult in the Holy One. Finally, consider how standing firm in faith is the invited response to the splendor of Israel's God, which radiates through creation. It is in the temple and its worship that the Holy One is present and accessible. This is why Jerusalem is the city of pilgrimage and assembly, also for those descendants of Israel's ancestors who have found a new home outside the land of Canaan, in Mesopotamia or Egypt, and later also in Asia Minor, Greece, or the Western Mediterranean. We encounter these and other aspects of the holiness of Israel's God expressed in Isaiah's powerful language. The prophet uses striking phrases, creative images, and even plays on words. Think of the condemnation of those who join house to house and add field to field, thus amassing real estate unjustly. Or recall memorable images, such as the wolf living with the lamb and the lion eating straw like the ox. Anticipations of a peaceable kingdom cherished ever since these lines were penned. Plays on words work only when the hearers know the language being used. One illustration may suffice. The vineyard song in the 5th chapter concludes with the Lord's disappointment in not harvesting good grapes. Instead of expected justice, there was bloodshed, a cry rather than righteousness. Now in Hebrew, the contrasting word pairs sound alike, except for one consonant, mishpat, mishpach, ze'aka, tzedakah. Clearly, Isaiah and his disciples were messengers from whom the word of the Lord demanded a creative use of word and image. The book of Isaiah is one of the longest among the prophetic books. We know that Isaiah, who was active in the late 8th century in the capital of the kingdom of Judah, in Jerusalem, had disciples. They passed on both their master's spirit and his words from generation to generation, until the original announcement of destruction and exile, of which we already spoke, had been fulfilled. The burning of the temple and the Babylonian exile took place in the 6th century. Small wonder that the voices of the last disciples are formulated with these momentous events as backdrop. Hence chapters 40 through 55 are attributed to Isaiah of Babylon. As for chapters 1 through 39, let me review what you have been reading. The first 4 chapters are a preview of the entire book. Its theme is simple. The citizens of Jerusalem and the people of Judah are increasingly failing in their mission. Estrangement from their divine Lord and reliance on their own strength and their allies' strength is bringing disaster. While God's zeal chastises them severely, divine mercy is already at work. The call to return to the Lord will be heeded and Zion redeemed by justice. In short, the prologue points to the message that progressively unfolds throughout the book. Then 3 main sections, chapters 5 through 27 and 28 through 35, 36 through 39, show how divine interventions overcame 2 severe threats to Jerusalem's existence. The first is focused in chapter 7 and narrates how a threatened siege by the armies of the Israelite and the Aramean kings failed. The second siege occurred a generation later and is told in chapters 36 through 37. It was more serious than the first, because now it was the army of the Assyrian world power who, to use the words of an Assyrian court scribe, had shut up King Hezekiah in Jerusalem, his royal city, like a bird in a cage. But again, Jerusalem was miraculously rescued through divine action. In summary, Isaiah 1 through 39 contains many poetically formulated utterances that, when taken together, are cumulative. They show how the Holy One of Israel repeatedly intervened on Zion's behalf and provided reprieve from the destruction and exile that, more than a century later, became its fate. Chapters 40 through 66 then proceed to show how even in this seemingly irreversible situation, Jerusalem eventually triumphs. It is rebuilt at the command of Cyrus, the victorious Persian king. In the centuries that followed, the city of David became the symbolic center of worldwide Judaism. As such, it was later the stage of Jesus' crucifixion, of the founding of the church, and of the beginning of that creation-wide restoration that the concluding chapters of Isaiah's book already attest when they speak of new heavens and a new earth.